Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 8 lecture. So now that we have finished Edgar Huntley, we move on to our next major text of the semester, Hope Leslie, or Early Times in the Massachusetts by Catherine Maria Sedgwick. Now, it has been brought to my attention recently that this book was not included in the required materials listed on the GBC bookstore website. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure why it's not there. It should have been there. Might have been my mistake. Might have been their mistake. Maybe a combination of the two. But if you were relying on the bookstore and you didn't see this title, I understand. I'll try to extend a little bit of grace. Hopefully you can get the book on relatively short notice. And of course, you don't have to go through the bookstore. There are lots of other ways to acquire these books. There are lots of used copies of the book floating around the internet. So it's not too late to get the book, and maybe some of you did notice on the syllabus that we had this title listed as one of our required books, and it was also on the reading schedule, but I do apologize that it wasn't there on the bookstore site. I thought it was. So if you're having trouble getting the book, if you're having trouble finding it, let me know, but otherwise we should be okay. I'm assuming most of us are ready to start reading the novel this week. Now, another quick note, I've already mentioned this, it is a pretty long novel. It's a good bit longer than Edgar Huntley, and we only have a week to devote to it. So that's not ideal, and I understand that some of us might still be finishing up the book a little bit later, like in week 9, maybe in week 10. I'll just remind you guys again briefly that I made a quick change to the schedule when I realized that we were spending too much time on Edgar Huntley. So we are combining some stuff next week, and we're going to be looking at Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe in honor of Halloween. We're going to cover all three of those authors next week. And then in week 10, we have a lighter reading load, and that's by design. I want everybody to be able to catch up by the end of week 10. So if you're still finishing up Hope Leslie, if you're still finishing up Edgar Huntley, or any of the stuff that we're looking at next week in week 9, I want you to try to catch up by week 10, because that week we don't have a ton to look at, no major works. We're just going to be looking at some excerpts from popular fiction of the sort of mid-19th century. That's really all we're doing in week 10. So we're just going to be looking at a few individual chapters, maybe a couple of other short works, but it is a lighter week. So hopefully by the end of week 10, we're all totally caught up, and you need to be, because week 11 is Melville, and we really need to devote our full attention to Melville in week 11. So if you have any issues, if you're having struggles with the schedule or with any of these books, just email me and we can talk. All right, so Hope Leslie comes out in 1827. And I want to talk a little bit more today about the frontier romance genre that I've already mentioned. So we can tell we're moving forward in our sort of historical chronology, our sort of tour of American literary history. We go from the very beginning of the 1800s with Edgar Huntley, about 30 years later, to Hope Leslie at the end of the 1820s. So I'll just want to remind you guys of something I was talking about last week when we were still discussing Brown. I mentioned that after Brown, we have sort of what we might consider the second generation of American writers, or maybe the first generation of homegrown American writers who were born either during or after the American Revolution. That's what makes Sedgwick's generation really a bit different. So Sedgwick, James Fenimore Cooper, to some extent Washington Irving, even though he's a little bit older, they're all really the first generation of American writers to grow up in a newly independent United States. So their experiences are quite a bit different than those of Brown or Freneau or Hannah Webster Foster, that earlier generation of writers who were all born prior to independence. So they were all born during our colonial past, and even though in some cases they were still kind of young when independence occurred, they still had that kind of dual identity, the sort of colonial pre-revolution identity when they were still English subjects, and then what came later. So it is a little different when we think about the next generation, Sedgwick, Cooper, Irving, because they are coming up in the early Republic. They are very much growing up or coming of age in that historical period that we've called the era of the early Republic. But Sedgwick, we're going to notice she is invested in some of the same larger purposes or projects of some of the earlier writers that we've already been studying. So much like Brown and much like Freneau, some of these forerunners, some of these predecessors, Sedgwick is very interested in creating a literature that could be considered distinctly or uniquely American. She was looking to create stuff that could be differentiated from British or other European national literatures. So she's not the first one to be interested in doing that, right? We've already kind of seen that trend at work as early as Freneau. And we talked about, with Freneau and obviously with Brown, we talked about one thing that they were doing, right? They were importing that Gothic romance style, that Gothic romance genre from the British Isles, and they were adapting it to American subject matter. So that really meant American terrain, a big emphasis on geography, our mountains, our bodies of water, our forests. And as we've seen, certainly Brown and many of his contemporaries would have considered that geography, that terrain, to be a little bit scary, to be sublime in certain ways, to be mysterious, at least to white Europeans or the descendants of white Europeans. And also, as we saw with Brown, there was a lot of frontier conflict. So that was also what those geographical spaces kind of represented. The potential for violence, the potential for, sort of volatile situations, because of course they're reflecting the very real American history of frontier violence between Native Americans and white settlers. So we've already noticed that this is something that early American writers are doing. Right? As we are trying to establish our own national literature, we have to sort of borrow pre-existing forms, pre-existing genres from England or other parts of Europe, and then we're adapting them to American subject matter, American history, culture, and even mythology. And like we saw with Freneau, certainly he wants to make the case, that America has an ancient history. America has a mythology all its own. But what he realized, he was one of the first really to kind of understand that to talk about American history, to talk about American mythology, you really have to talk about Native Americans, and you have to at least acknowledge, if not foreground, the conflict between Native Americans and white settlers. So Freneau does that a little bit, Brown does that a little bit, but we're going to see it a lot more in Sedgwick, because Sedgwick is not writing a Gothic romance here, she's writing a frontier romance. And if we want to update our terminology, we could maybe just consider this a work of historical fiction, because it very much is, and that's a genre that's still with us today, right? A lot of y'all can probably think of examples of historical fiction that you've read, or, maybe historical fiction in the form of television or movies. This still remains a pretty popular genre with American audiences. So I mentioned that in some ways, part of what Brown was doing in Edgar Huntley could sort of be considered a frontier romance, but I kind of gave you advance warning that we weren't truly going to see a frontier romance until we read Hope Leslie. So let's talk a little bit more about that genre, where it comes from, how it develops, and how in many ways it is still with us. It's still a very important part of American popular culture. So I talked about this a little bit last week. Much of what we think of as frontier romance, or as a sort of basic formula for this kind of novel, came from Sir Walter Scott, who was I think he was from Scotland originally, but obviously writing in the British Isles at the very beginning of the 1800s. And he wrote a series of books like Rob Roy, Ivanhoe, and they all had a sort of similar formula that would be adopted by a lot of American writers. So what Scott would do is he would sort of pick a historical time period from the British past, and he would use that as the backdrop or the setting of his novel. And then he would populate his novels largely with invented characters. He would make them up, but every once in a while there would be real people also featured in the novel. So he was really drawing heavily on real history. He did a lot of research. He wanted to get a lot of the historical details correct. He wanted to be accurate, but it was still understood as a work of fiction, right? Because the characters weren't real, the plot was invented, but he was using the real history as the backdrop, as sort of, embellishment in a way. It was there to give the story a sort of greater resonance or a greater relevance, because it might have been symbolic or, significant to some, historical period that readers would have known about and cared about. So that was the formula, and it was very popular not only over there, but also here amongst American audiences and American writers. So Sedgwick was just one of many American authors who really liked Scott and wanted to sort of do what he was doing, only in an American context. So both Sedgwick and her contemporary James Fenimore Cooper were very much influenced by Scott, and they were working within that same general genre that was referred to, at least in America, often as frontier romance. But again, nowadays we just maybe would call it historical fiction because we don't really use the term romance anymore. But just remember the way it was used. We've talked about it in a couple of different contexts. We talked about Gothic romance with Brown. But if we're discussing frontier romance, remember, the romance as a thing doesn't mean the same as what we mean today if we talk about a romantic comedy. The romance was a sort of pre-novelistic form of prose fiction. Sometimes it was in verse, but often in prose. Really goes back to the Middle Ages, maybe even antiquity. So these were prose narratives, usually centered around a heroic male protagonist overcoming various obstacles and achieving his goals. So oftentimes he would be rescuing a damsel, overcoming supernatural forces, fighting, goblins or dragons or wizards or, stuff like that. So there was a long history of that. It was very popular all the way up to the modern period, really. So we talked about this weeks ago with the rise of realistic novels. We said that people knew what a romance was. A romance was improbable. It was not supposed to be realistic. It was supposed to be kind of fantastical, supernatural elements, a lot of improbable plot developments, and people understood, hey, this is fiction. This is not meant to be taken as real. But then when they started, but they kind of felt like all prose should be like that. But then when newspapers got big, and then when we started to have realistic novels that sounded realistic, and even some of the people in the novels seemed like they were either stand-ins for real people or they could be real people, that was initially confusing to a lot of English language readers because it wasn't a romance, it wasn't a poem. So what was it? It took some time to kind of understood how to read realistic novels. But by now, by the 19th century, everybody kind of understands. But that was a bit of a process. But you got to remember, even though realistic novels are becoming more and more ascendant throughout this century, people still remembered what romances were. And some readers still enjoyed romances. So for much of the 19th century, there would often be a distinction made between a romance versus a novel. Nowadays, we don't really distinguish. It doesn't matter how outlandish the subject matter is, we are still going to probably just call it a novel. But through much of the 19th century, a lot of writers and audiences would have still thought of a romance as being something that was less realistic, something that had, kind of archetypal characters, almost allegorical in terms of the meaning, lots of improbable events, maybe still some supernatural stuff if you're reading Hawthorne. He talks a lot about this, so we'll kind of return to some of these ideas next week when we read Hawthorne. But there was this idea that if it wasn't really meant to be realistic, it was more of a romance, even if it took the form, more or less, of a novel, what we would think of in the modern world as a novel. Versus, so again, if it was kind of improbable, not realistic, well, that's a romance. Whereas if the novel was meant to be realistic, if it really was kind of a slice of life or based on real events, or the characters just seemed like they could be real people in real situations, then that was a novel. Right? So there was this kind of artificial distinction between novels and romances. That distinction's gone now. Like I said, we don't really care what the novel is about. If it's an extended prose narrative, it's a novel. It can be sci-fi, it can be fantasy, it can be super realistic. It doesn't matter. We call all of them novels. But just remember, that's kind of a modern thing. Like, that's what we do. That's not necessarily what readers would have done in the 19th century. So be aware of some of those distinctions. So a novel like this would have been considered a romance in certain ways because there are a lot of improbable plot developments. There's no supernatural stuff, not really, but just in the way the plot's constructed, in the way that we sort of have an extended hero's journey. That's very reminiscent of those older romances. And also just some of the plot devices, just some of the mechanisms that kind of make this story work would have been familiar to people who read romances. Even some of the character types are very reminiscent of like older romances. So that would have been how a lot of readers understood it. But at the same time, and this is kind of confusing, it was also clearly rooted in actual history, actual American history. And Sedgwick wanted to be pretty clear about that, and she wanted readers to use this as kind of an instructional tool while also being entertained, right? So it's a genre that I think we understand and recognize today, even though there was different terminology used to describe it back then. Because, like I've said, we all know what historical fiction is, and this really could be just considered an early example of American historical fiction. And like Brown, who has different goals, but they do share this in common, like Brown, Sedgwick is going back to a real chapter of American history to provide context, a backdrop, a setting for her narrative. But she's a lot more interested in the history, I would say, than Brown is. Like, Brown is sort of elliptical and a little bit vague about the actual events that have occurred between white settlers and the Delaware tribe outside of Philadelphia. He kind of beats around the bush. He doesn't explicitly talk about the treaty that was violated from the 1730s, but he does give us an idea that, the Delawares have been displaced and they're angry about it. So that's really kind of the central conflict that eventually boils over into all this violence. But as we saw, saw, Brown kind of uses the Delawares as the scapegoat. They are the villains, really, along with, Clitheroe's a villain too, but, the Delawares are ultimately responsible for Waldegrave's death, for the death that Edgar is investigating. A lot of the mysterious actions are later attributed to Delawares, like marauding war parties operating under the direction of Old Deb. So as we saw, Brown isn't all that interested in humanizing his Native American characters, making them three-dimensional. He doesn't really seem to have a ton of sympathy for them, even though he does acknowledge that, at least, kind of using Old Deb as the mouthpiece, he kind of acknowledges that the Delaware had been dispossessed, and they were kind of upset about it, and they, justified their actions by pointing out that the white settlers had done equally bad things to them. So, in his kind of indirect way, Brown does shed a light on some of that real history of frontier conflict. But Sedgwick does it in a much more comprehensive, rigorous way. It's not just kind of an incidental part of the plot for her. It's very front and center. And she's going back to an even earlier period of American history. She's going all the way back to the Pequot War, which took place between 1636 and 1638. And this was a pretty pivotal moment because we're still very early on in the sort of English colonization of New England. So we've already talked about the Puritans a little bit, particularly Bradstreet. We mentioned them as really among the first writers, at least the first English language writers in the New World. Not only were they some of the first English settlers to come over to the New World, but they were also documenting a lot of their experiences. So they didn't really privilege literature that much, but they wrote a lot of history. They wrote captivity narratives, particularly Mary Rowlandson. They wrote sermons, lots of sermons, and in the case of Bradstreet and others, also some poetry and other works. So we've talked about them a little bit. They were dissenters from the Church of England. They were sort of persecuted for their different religious practices. They're still Christians, obviously. They're still Protestants, but they weren't conducting themselves like the Church of England wanted them to. They had different rituals, slightly different beliefs, different practices. So they were really kind of marginalized and persecuted to a large extent because of that difference. And that is largely what drove them to come here. So they would have the freedom to practice their own religion. So we know a little bit about the Puritans. Now we're going to spend a lot of time with a handful of Puritans. Many of our characters in Hope Leslie are Puritans, and they're part of these early colonial efforts in Massachusetts. Sedgwick herself was the descendant of a couple of really prominent old Puritan families that had been in New England for, multiple generations. By the time Sedgwick is born, they had been there for almost 150 years, which for that time was pretty old. That's about as long as any Anglo settlers had been in the future U.S. So she's drawing on a history that she knows well. It's the history of her own ancestors. But what we want to sort of notice with Sedgwick, what we want to be aware of as we're reading this book, is that she's doing some interesting things with history and with the frontier romance genre. So one thing we're going to notice right off the bat is that she's largely sort of telling this story of early times in Massachusetts through the perspective of women. Largely through the perspective of Hope, but also Native American women in some cases, mostly Magawiska. But this is a story that's largely mediated, largely understood through the perspective of female characters. So that alone makes it very different from a lot of other frontier romances. I've mentioned James Fenimore Cooper a few times. We're not reading him but I mentioned that he's just a kind of an important figure to keep in mind as we, continue to understand American literary history. He wrote some important novels, particularly Last of the Mohicans was part of a larger series that he did, a whole series of frontier romances, and his main character, Leatherstocking, was sort of the quintessential Benjamin Church style frontier hero. If you remember, I mentioned Church a little bit, another Puritan writer who fought in some of these early Native American conflicts on behalf of the English and later wrote about his experiences and made himself out to be sort of a hero. A lot of historians and lit scholars look at Church as kind of establishing this template for what we often call the frontier hero or the hunter scout archetype, and this character type has really stuck around for a long time. So Church might have helped to start it, but Cooper really popularizes it in the 1820s with his Leatherstocking character. And if you've ever seen the movie adaptation of Last of the Mohicans, Daniel Day-Lewis plays that role. It was a pretty well-known film from the 90s. That's how a lot of people know that text. I kind of prefer the movie to the book myself. Cooper's not a great read for modern people. His prose has not aged well. Sedgwick, I think, is better stylistically. But Cooper does a lot, has a big impact with that character type, and he popularizes it, and it gets picked up by other writers, and it really continues throughout the 19th century. We see a lot of examples of that character type. They're often kind of rough and tumble. As I mentioned with Church, they're kind of othered because they've lived a lot of their life on the frontier. They've often lived with Native Americans. They've often kind of left white society to go and live on the margins and learn more about Native American culture. And in the process, they kind of become alienated from white society, yet they're able to help the white society ultimately vanquish the Native Americans and push Anglo settlement further to the west. This is a story that gets repeated throughout a lot of popular fiction in the 19th century, and when we move up to the 20th century, we still see that same basic character type in a lot of westerns. A lot of what we now think of as westerns, whether they be novels or movies. If you've ever seen an old western with John Wayne or Jimmy Stewart or one of these old-time movie stars, they're sort of often playing a version of that role. They're a tough cowboy or a rancher or a sort of a renegade on the margins of society, helping white civilization defeat Native Americans, and that often was the plot. There would be different permutations, different circumstances, but in some way or another, that was sort of the basic formula, and you could argue the character's still around. I think we've become a little bit more aware of some of the ways that that character type is problematic. I think more recent westerns, more recent texts that treat this same subject matter tend to want to make the casting maybe a little bit diverse. They want to maybe complicate this sort of simple narrative that we've heard so much throughout American history, but obviously we still kind of know the narrative and we still know the character type. So that character type, the Leatherstocking, John Wayne type, is not really here. Instead, we get Hope. So a lot of people argue that in this novel, Hope is the frontier hero. Hope is the sort of rugged frontiersman who is helping to advance white civilization. But she's doing that, if we think that she is doing that, we can notice that she's doing it in a different way. She's not doing it through violence. She's not doing it through brute force, right? She's doing it in a more diplomatic way. She's doing it in a way that's more sort of in accordance to her social role and her sort of sphere of influence, which we might think is largely sort of domestic back then, considering the limitations placed on women during, that time period. But if we think about the character and how she develops, how she's described, we know that she is a little bit headstrong. She is a little bit stubborn. And in some cases, she does sort of violate rules of the local Puritan society. Oftentimes, she breaks those rules because she is advocating on behalf of her Native American friends. Or she is rebelling against what she thinks is sort of unjust authority being wielded by the Puritan elders, who are, of course, always white, always male. So she's kind of mildly rebellious, I would say. She doesn't do anything really bad that would make readers perhaps, scandalized or really unsure about her morals. But she does show herself to be willing to kind of break some rules, to break a few sort of rules of politeness or decorum in order to do what's right. And we also see her doing a lot of brave deeds. We see her at times putting her own safety at risk. And then we see a kind of parallel course with Magawiska, who's a very different character with a different background, but there are parallels we can make between Hope and Magawiska. They have a lot of the same traits. They're both brave. They're both morally upright. Remember, I was telling you in Edgar Huntley, we don't really have a reliable moral authority. Edgar is a sleepwalker, doesn't know how violent he can be. Clitheroe's a maniac. The Delawares are kind of villainized and turned into bad people as well. So in that novel, we almost don't know where to turn when it comes to, all right, well, who's right? Who is doing right? Who knows what's right? None of our main characters, like there's some minor characters like maybe the Sarsfield guy or whoever the teacher or the ex-teacher was, like some voices of reason, but they're not main characters. Our main characters are all either kind of addled or they're psychopaths and they're all violent. So that's part of what makes that novel so disorienting. It's like, who do we align ourselves with? It's hard to know. We don't necessarily have that problem here. We have three morally upright characters that would have really tracked as admirable and likable to most readers. But what's interesting, well, I'd even expand that to four. It's a long novel, right? So we really end up with four characters who kind of occupy that role. But what's interesting is that three of the four are women. So Hope, Magawiska, Esther, and then Everil. Everil's kind of boring, but I would say out of all the men in the novel, he's probably the most well-developed character. Either him or his father. I mean, we do spend some time with William, especially in the beginning. But I would argue our four real main characters in the novel would be Hope, Magawiska, Esther, and Everil. Probably in that order. We might elevate Everil to like third place, but that's probably about as high as he's going to get. So again, they are all portrayed as like fundamentally good people. But what's interesting, again, 3 out of the 4 are women, so we get a different perspective than we would have gotten in a lot of other frontier romances of the time. But also, one of the characters is Native American. So we notice another thing that Sedgwick is doing here. She doesn't just want to give women more of a say in this particular novel, although she very much does. She also wants to humanize Native Americans in general, right? And that's why we get this very sort of sympathetic, positive portrayal of Magawiska. Because part of what Sedgwick is doing here is trying to show that some Native Americans possess the same noble qualities that we can find in white people. And I know that's kind of tiresome to a modern audience because we don't really need to be reminded of that. Most of us already understand that. But remember the time period. Remember that we are in the 1820s, and it's important to know a little bit about what's kind of going on during the 1820s. There's a big public and political debate ongoing, and it was often referred to back then. We wouldn't really use this terminology now, but it was often referred to back then as the Indian problem. And in short, I'm not going to do this justice. This is not a history class after all. In short, the question was, what were white people, what was the government going to do about all the Native Americans who remained east of the Mississippi River in the early 1800s? So there were still pretty sizable populations up and down the East Coast. They were obviously dispossessed, forced to live on reservations in many cases. They had lost a lot of their land. They did not have equal rights, even though they were supposed to. But there were still pretty big population centers. And frankly, a lot of white people on the eastern seaboard wanted them to be gone. And the government sort of wanted them to be gone. So there could continue to be urbanization, industrialization, modernization as they saw it. And also there was this sort of open question as to whether or not Native Americans could be fully assimilated into American culture and society. So you guys probably know how that debate turned out. By 1830, we get the Indian Removal Act, which was an official act, enacted by the federal government, and it's often colloquially referred to as the Trail of Tears, at least for many of the southeastern tribes. But basically, this was an edict issued by the federal government. This was forced relocation. All the Native Americans still living east of the Mississippi were pretty much told, you got to go. You got to leave. And they were rounded up and taken mostly to the modern day state of Oklahoma. It was not a state yet, and it was considered Indian territory back then. So basically, the government had decided that Oklahoma was not fit for white people, so that would be where they would, round up all the Native Americans and force them to live. Now, of course, not everybody complied, not everybody went along with it, but many, many did. And this really, diminished those eastern populations of indigenous people. So again, we think of this as the Trail of Tears, but it wasn't just the Cherokee who often are associated with that particular trek. It wasn't just them. It was a bunch of tribes in the southeast, the mid-Atlantic, and the northeast were all forcibly removed. And of course, this was not a negotiation. This was not something that any of these indigenous leaders had really agreed to. They were forced to do it. So that was kind of the resolution to the debate or to that open question. And Indian removal happened in 1830, or it began. It took a while, but it began in 1830, just 3 years after the publication of this novel. So Sedgwick, in her personal life, she was not very political. She was not an advocate, really, for Native Americans in the way that some other writers were, like her contemporary, Lydia Maria Child, who we're going to be reading next week. But a lot of scholars will argue that, we're reading Child in 2 weeks. A lot of scholars will argue that with this novel and some of her other fiction, Sedgwick is making a case for the basic humanity of Native Americans. So it is kind of a political message, kind of her way of trying to remind white readers that Native Americans can be similar to white people. They can possess similar traits. And again, we might not view that as a real push for equality. And it wasn't really. It was just a push to recognize the humanity of these people, which again feels inadequate to us, but it was a somewhat significant move to make back then. So that's why we have some pretty obvious parallels between Magawiska and Hope. We should see that they share stuff in common, and they're both kind of on the right side of a lot of the conflicts and disputes that arise over the course of the novel. But Sedgwick is really trying to thread the needle here, because on one hand, she does want to humanize her Native American characters, at least some of them. I don't think she humanizes all of them. The ones that she likes, the ones that she deems to be admirable for whatever reason. And there's not many, really, besides Magawiska, but more or less, yeah, she is trying to humanize those characters, but she also wants to celebrate her own Puritan history. She wants to celebrate the Puritan settlers who did colonize New England over the course of the 1600s. So she's not here to explicitly criticize the white settlers. I would say there's some gentle criticism throughout the novel. There are some times where she acknowledges, or her narrator acknowledges, that violence was perpetrated on both sides. That in some cases, the local Native American groups, particularly the Pequots, were sort of driven or pushed to taking violent action because of things that the white settlers had done. She is acknowledging that some mistakes were made or some depredations were committed by the white settlers. So they're not blameless here, but she does put a fair amount of the blame also on some of the Native Americans for, seeking vengeance. And she tries to present the conflict as in a fairly even-handed way, as, not being any one group's sole fault or responsibility. So she's trying to celebrate the Puritan history while also acknowledging that Native Americans are not evil, they're not all bad, they're not subhuman. She's trying to do both, and that's actually kind of difficult. If you don't think so, try reading Cooper. See how Cooper treats his Native American characters. He makes them complete villains. He makes them brutish, like incapable of advanced thought or sophisticated action. That's his solution to the Indian problem. He makes his Indian characters completely one-dimensional and villainous, and the white characters are heroic, right? So that's how a lot of frontier romance worked, but that's not necessarily what Sedgwick wants to do. So we should be aware of that difference, and that's something we can kind of look for, just again, the treatment of the characters and the threading of the needle between celebrating the Puritans and also humanizing the Native Americans. But we can also see her perhaps taking part in another ongoing debate that we mentioned, at least in passing, with the coquette. Because we're still in the era of the early Republic. We're almost out of it here. Usually the sort of end date for that period is thought of as maybe the late 1820s or 1830 is often used as like the breaking point. After 1830, we kind of move into a new era. But we're still in the early decades of independence. So as I mentioned with the coquette, and as Kathy Davidson mentioned in that critical intro, it seemed like Hannah Webster Foster was interested in sort of figuring out what kind of role women would have in the new republic. As we know, they didn't have any political power. They had very little economic power. So there was this ongoing debate. Again, where do women fit in? What kinds of rights should women have? And if they're not going to vote, if they can't own property, if they can't hold elected office, what are they going to do? What are their responsibilities going to be? And how can they still sort of be a part of this larger democratic process, even if they're not participating in politics? So people were also talking about that, arguing about that. There were different positions on that. So again, Sedgwick isn't overtly political, or in her non-writing life, she's not somebody that's putting herself out there, but just by giving us these strong women characters, just by giving us a frontier romance hero who is a woman and has much different methods compared to her male counterparts, just by doing that, it does seem like Sedgwick is offering this sort of alternative vision for what maybe America could be. It seems like we might want somebody like Hope in a position of some authority. She seems like somebody who could be a leader, somebody who has a strong moral compass, somebody who is decisive, somebody who is doing what's right, somebody that's willing to help others, right? These are good qualities. These are leadership qualities. Now, of course, she's young, she's a teenager, so she can occasionally break the rules, be a little headstrong, but there's a lot to like in her makeup, and there's this sense that maybe somebody like her could lead the way towards a more tolerant, a more diverse kind of America where diversity can be accepted and celebrated. We kind of get a vision of what could have been, what might have been, what didn't really turn out to be. But at this early stage, maybe we do get an alternative presented to us. And we kind of see this early in the novel as well, because think about the kind of blended family that's on display through the first several chapters of the book, right? So I guess it's a little bit confusing with all the family dynamics and relationships, so I'll try to keep this brief. But at the very beginning, we meet Everill's father, William, right? William Fletcher, and we learn about his journey from England. Okay, so we need to know just a little bit about English history, at least so we understand the difference between royalists, who are not portrayed very well in this novel, compared to freedom-loving Puritans, who are associated more with parliamentarians or the Roundheads. So if you guys might remember from a history class once learning about the English Civil War, which obviously took place in England, not here, but it was taking place very close to the events depicted in the novel. So the English Civil War took place during the 1640s and 1650s. And it was fought between two sides. One side that supported the monarchy, so they were called royalists. They supported the royal, line of rulers, versus the parliamentarians or Roundheads. Now, many, though not all, of those Roundheads were Puritans, or they were other types of dissenters who were not members of the Church of England, whereas most royalists, most defenders of monarchy, would have been members of the Church of England. So that's a distinction that Sedgwick wants us to understand. On one side, we have the Church of England royalists, and they are portrayed, for the most part, as corrupt, decadent, dishonest, very, very sort of prejudicial and kind of a superior attitude, and we are not meant to like them for the most part. And then on the other hand, we have the freedom-loving parliamentarian Puritans, represented by William, and they are, just in this novel at least, they are the better people. They are right. They are good. They're often being exploited or taken advantage of by the dastardly royalists. But she wants us to understand the difference between those groups. And she wants us to understand that William and his family, they're on the right side. They're not Church of England. They're not monarchist. They support freedom. They support some early version of democracy. And again, they want to practice a slightly different faith from what the Church of England was all about, and they want the freedom to be able to do that. So just a little bit of that is worth knowing. And again, we're gonna see Governor John Winthrop here. That's a real person. So another tactic that was common in historical fiction or frontier romances of the time, using a few real figures from history along with the invented characters in the plot. So again, Sedgwick is drawing on real Puritan history with figures like Winthrop and also the Pequot War, which really did happen in the 1630s, and it was one of these early conflicts where the English defeated a sort of Native American confederation, in this case mostly made up of the Pequot tribe. So all of that's kind of stuff that we need to know. And then we learn about Fletcher and kind of what he does, right? So William comes over, he settles in what is now southwestern Massachusetts, the town of Springfield, along the Connecticut River. So it's a little confusing, Connecticut River, but he's in what is now Massachusetts, and he sort of sets up shop and starts a family. But he also brings in some Native American children to his household, and that was not atypical for the time period. And there were different reasons why that might have been done, but he does seem somewhat benevolent and tolerant of difference. And that's another key trait with all the good white characters in this novel, the way Sedgwick paints them. Part of what makes them good, this is true of Hope, it's true of Everill, it's true of Everill's dad. They're somewhat tolerant, right? They're not strongly biased against all Native Americans. They don't have a sort of deep-seated hatred for difference or for other kinds of people. That's something that readers are supposed to notice, and we're supposed to value that quality in those characters. So that's how Magawiska and her brother Aneko end up sort of, at least spending a good part of their childhoods in the Fletcher household, right? They sort of grow up along with Everil and along with Hope. But remember, Everil and Hope are not siblings, right? Hope does not belong, she is not the daughter of William. She's the daughter of William's former lover, who he was torn away from, right, by the dastardly royalists. So his former lover, Alice, dies on her way over to the New World, but that's after she's already given birth to Hope, and I guess Hope's sister, Faith, as well. So they lose their parents at an early age. Alice dies, and the soldier that she had married, that's where the last name Leslie comes from, he dies too. So both of their parents are gone, they're sort of orphans, and they're ultimately brought into the Fletcher household along with their auntie, Grafton, who's a royalist, who is not a Puritan. It's important to note that not all of the white characters here are a Puritan. So the auntie is a royalist and a member of the Church of England, so she thinks Puritans are kind of weird. And then there's also Craddock, they're like male servant, or one of the servants that we see here. So it's kind of a mixed household, right? There's, William Fletcher, his wife, his own children, and then 2 Native American children, and then Hope and Faith, who are the children of his ex-lover, but they don't belong to him. That's still kind of weird, but I guess it works out. So for those first several chapters, we see this kind of somewhat tranquil, sort of domestic scene. And again, it gives us this sense that maybe all of these different groups could live together in harmony. So if you guys read the critical intro, if you get this edition of the book, I actually wanted to mention that earlier. I thought that I ordered the Penguin Classics edition. That's the one that I put on the syllabus. If you look at the ISBN number, I'd like you guys to get this edition if you could, because there's a really good critical intro written by Carolyn Karcher that I would like you guys to read. But one of the big points that Karcher makes, she says this is a very innovative novel. This is a very innovative work of frontier romance for multiple reasons. Some of the reasons we've already covered. But another reason is she says it's dialogic. It's multivocal. What does that mean? It means that there are multiple voices on display in this book. We don't just get one perspective. Right? We don't just get the Puritan perspective. That's a lot of what we get, but we also hear from Native American characters, right? Mostly Magawiska. We also hear from some white characters who aren't Puritans. And again, many of them are not depicted well, but at least with, Auntie, she's no villain. We might laugh at her a little bit. She's vain. She's kind of shallow, but she's still somewhat likable. And then we meet Sir Philip, who's very much a figure from earlier romances, a dastardly, decadent sort of emblem of the old world. I think he's even Catholic, which for Sedgwick, for a lot of Protestants in New England in the early 19th century, Catholic equaled corrupt and decadent and worldly. Like, that's how they thought of Catholics, because they had a lot of prejudice towards Catholics. So he was a very familiar type of character. Readers would have recognized him, again, from older romances. Like, he's a classic villain that would have stood in the hero's way in old chivalric romance. So she's kind of hearkening back to the older romances with that character type. We also notice that she uses a little bit of a sentimental novel strategy at times. There are some tropes and techniques that we would have found in sentimental novels. Again, some of the improbable plot developments, some of the relationship stuff that would have been very common in a sentimental novel to sort of follow the romantic struggles of the heroine. So we have that love triangle with Hope and Everil and Esther that eventually gets resolved, but there's misunderstandings and people's feelings get hurt, and eventually we realize that Hope and Everill are going to end up together. But this is kind of what Karcher means. Like, there's a lot in here, right? It's innovative. It's really sort of formally and technically innovative, and also we just get a real multitude of perspectives and voices. Different women, different kinds of white people with different religious backgrounds. And then we also hear from some Native American characters, and we even get some Native American versions of events. Again, largely through Magawiska, but another perspective, another way of understanding this history, not just through the lens of the white characters. I would say it's mostly through the lens of white characters, but we do get other perspectives, other points of view. So that's important. And even when it comes to genre, right? There's some frontier romance, there's some sentimental stuff. It's really a nice mixture. And in some ways, that's what makes it a little bit more modern. And that's why I think it's held up better. There's a reason that we read this and not Last of the Mohicans. Last of the Mohicans feels very much at every moment like we are in the 1820s. This book feels a little bit more forward-looking, both in the way it's put together, the perspectives it expresses, and also kind of this more optimistic vision maybe for what America could be. But yeah, that's largely what Karcher means when she's talking about the book being dialogic. And if you look at a chapter like chapter 8 in volume 1, this is kind of an example where we get different characters' voices literally in the book, right? So we have this third person narrator who tells most of the story for us. But we also get these passages where we hear directly from some of these characters, right? So in chapter 8, we get a letter written by Hope to Everill, who's in England, like doing some of his studies overseas in England, which would have been common for any well-born colonial American during that time. So we hear Hope's voice, right? But not only do we hear her without any mediation from the narrator, we also hear her tell an interesting story about Nelema, the Native American servant or sort of like nurse kind of. I'm not quite sure how to define her role, but she later gets accused of witchcraft. Right? But Hope supports her and advocates for her. And in that letter to Everill, she's talking about Native American spirituality and medicine. And she even makes reference to the prejudice of other Puritans. And she's kind of rebelling against that because she knows that a lot of the Puritans in her community are wrong about Nelema, wrong about other Native Americans, prejudiced, biased, ignorant, largely, of Native Americans. She knows that. Everill comes to know that. A lot of the other white characters don't really seem to understand in the same way. So we hear her voice, and then at other points, we're going to hear from Magawiska, we're going to hear from other characters. So that's kind of what Karcher means when she says we get multiple voices. It is dialogic. It's not mono, it's multiple, it's more than one. So I don't want to do a lot of plot summary. There's a lot of twists and turns. You need to be paying attention, but we don't need to get too hung up on the plot. But do notice that Hope acts up a little bit, like largely by trying to sort of bust Nelema out of her captivity. Hope kind of runs into some trouble with the authority figures in the colony. So she's eventually shipped out to Boston to go live with John Winthrop and his wife. That's kind of a punishment. It's kind of done so she can stay on the straight and narrow, so she can sort of act in a way that was considered more appropriate for young women at that time period. So just kind of be aware, a little bit like Eliza in The Coquette. We have to be aware that Hope is sort of violating some of the rules that were in place for young women in her time and place. But as modern readers, we probably support her breaking a lot of those rules because we see that she usually has a good reason for doing what she's doing. Maybe her methods are not always the best, but she's always acting out of good faith and good intentions. So, and that seems to be recognized by everybody. Nobody thinks she's a bad person. Nobody thinks she's like morally bankrupt. They just feel like she needs a little bit more discipline. That's ultimately what William kind of decides, and that seems to be how the Winthrops kind of view her as well. So, yeah, she's sometimes crossing the line in the eyes of the Puritan authority structure. But we might appreciate a lot of those moves that she makes. And it seems like even from the perspective of early 1800s readers, we probably can appreciate what she's doing because she is often right on some level. Yeah, so Everill eventually comes back from England, and we notice some of the same things with him. Like, he doesn't quite fit in so great anymore with the other Puritans because he's been living in a non-Puritan household back in England, and he's begun to kind of understand the larger world. He's a bit more open-minded, he's more tolerant, and that causes some problems for him. Like, other Puritans in the colony think that he's too worldly, right? Puritans had a big problem with people who were more interested in like kind of, worldly possessions or worldly knowledge versus spiritual knowledge or, theological stuff. Like if they thought you were too fixated on looking good, traveling, having nice things, even going to school and learning was somewhat worldly. And for them, all of that needed to be secondary to your devotion to God. So when Everill comes back, a lot of people are like, he's too worldly. Like he's not religious enough. He's not devoted enough according to the standards that govern that particular society. So both he and Hope are maybe a little too liberal, a little bit too progressive for their own community. But again, I don't think we're supposed to take that as criticism of the characters. It's more of a gentle criticism of the larger community because Hope and Everill are really being endorsed as more of the moral authorities. But so is Magawiska. Don't forget what happens in chapter 7 when she sacrifices her arm to save Everill. So this is after that idyllic domestic scene gets broken up. We have the raid, we have the kidnapping, right? And it looks like Everill's going to be sacrificed by Mononoto, Magawiska's father and the chieftain of this group of Pequots. But ultimately, she throws herself in front of him, throws herself in front of the blade, saves Everill's life, and gives up her arm in the process. So it's a little over the top, but it's clear what we're supposed to kind of do with that, right? We're supposed to understand that Magawiska is noble and brave, and perhaps most importantly, she recognizes that Everill is good too. So she recognizes that Everill deserves saving, and that's why she does it. A lot of readers, and I felt this way too when I first read the book, a lot of readers early on feel like maybe there's a romance brewing between Magawiska and Everill. But an interracial relationship during this time period would have been very scandalous for a lot of audiences and for a lot of authors, and Sedgwick does not go that far. She kind of maybe hints at it, but ultimately we understand that Magawiska and Everill are just good buddies, but they really appreciate each other. That's what's important. So maybe interracial romance is not available in Sedgwick's vision, but interracial friendship very much is. And it can be a friendship between equals. That's kind of the vibe we get with Everill and Magawiska. They appreciate each other. They see the value in each other. And we might see that with Hope and Magawiska as well. So they're kind of on an equal plane. Now, you might argue that Magawiska is the only Native American character who gets elevated to that level. But again, that's noteworthy just to have one, really, for this time period, and it shows, again, that Sedgwick wants to humanize a larger group of people. All right, so I won't talk too much about Volume 2 because I know that a lot of us probably will not get there this week. So unlike a lot of lectures, I will spare you. I will not reveal any spoilers in case you're still reading. A lot happens in Volume 2. We sometimes do have these interludes where it feels a little bit more like a domestic novel. It feels a little bit more like a sentimental novel because a lot of it's revolving around interpersonal relationships. But remember, it is a frontier romance first and foremost. So we get a lot of action. And even though the plot is often improbable, maybe a little bit melodramatic, you must acknowledge that it is almost never boring. Sedgwick keeps the action moving. Again, that's part of what makes this novel feel more vibrant and modern. The pacing is pretty modern. We have a lot going on. We don't have a ton of digressions. We don't have a ton of philosophizing like we get in earlier novels like Edgar Huntley, which can sometimes feel longer than they are. Sedgwick keeps the focus on the action and the characters, but just remember, there is some gentle criticism of Puritans here. There is some social criticism, but it's usually packaged in such a way that it won't sting too much, right? She wants to celebrate the white settlers that came before her, but she also wants to carve out a space for certain Native American characters, the ones that she deems admirable, like Magawiska. So we can notice that kind of cultural or social commentary existing right alongside the frontier romance, the action, the adventure. And again, if we're thinking about how the frontier romance evolves, a lot of scholars will argue that it eventually becomes the Western of the 20th century. The John Wayne figure, riding to the rescue, vanquishing the Native Americans and making white civilization possible. Now we complicate that. Now that's a more complex narrative, but we got to remember that from the early 1800s until probably at least like the late 20th century, that was one of the most popular narratives in American pop culture. And we got a ton of mileage out of it. We might see a few more examples before the semester is over. But it is an interesting project to kind of track that lineage. How does the frontier romance evolve in this country? All right, so that's enough for this week. Next week should be fun. I'm going to keep our Irving and Hawthorne stuff kind of brief so we can enjoy Poe and read some spooky stuff in honor of Halloween. So if you have any questions or if you're struggling to get the book, just let me know.